It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, let us swear. It's a long, long way to Tipperary.
What I want to talk to you about is, firstly, the infantry battalion commanders of the British Expeditionary Force of 1914. But what I'm trying to do in talking about them is address the question of the quality of the pre-war British infantry officer, of which much negative has been said by historians such as Tim Travers and Martin Samuels, which always fails to address the question, which is that these men, the army led by these supposedly inadequate men, beat the supposedly more professional German army in 1918. And I want to continue to reinforce the positive perception of them, which is growing. 10th of March 1915, this battalion commander died in front of uncut wire at Neuve-Chapelle. With him, 9 of his officers died. You probably, if you know the story, know exactly how they came to die. The howitzers brought up to bombard. Their portion of the wire hadn't been registered and took no part of the attack. And the 2nd Scottish Rifles and the 2nd Middlesex copped for it rotten. Bliss was leading his men at the time with his adjutant and was one of the first to fall. Those 9 officers, dead officers, who you can see in a row in Browns Road Cemetery in Festubert, represented 121 years of soldiering. Battalion was led out of action by 2nd Lieutenant W.F. Somervale, who had actually been commissioned in the Special Reserve in August 1914, and he only led 143 men out of action. For the next 2 months, the battalion was taken over by 2 1st Battalion officers, one of whom was superseded and one of whom was wounded. And then this man returned. He'd been the 2nd in command of the battalion when they went to war. And he, of course, is George Tupper Campbell, Carter Campbell. And he'd been wounded in the head at Neuve-Chapelle, and he returns in 17th of September 1915, and of course at that point he's promoted Brigadier General, as you see him in these pictures, and he's the little short bloke in the picture on the left. And he commands. He's firstly promoted Brigadier General, and then of course he's promoted Major General of the 51st Highland Division. When he leaves, the battalion is taken over by Captain Vincent Corbett Sandilands, and he commands the battalion on and off until the end of the war. He was a captain in 1912, he'd served as an adjutant to the Special Reserve, and he was 16th in seniority in the regiment in August 1914, and he was aged 35 at the outbreak of war. Now, what we see in this battalion is, if you like, the best of the changes of battalion command in the BEF during the war. Firstly, we've got a original battalion commander who, for one reason or other, as many of the original battalion commanders were, as we will see, lost to the battalion. A very experienced senior officer comes through to take over the battalion. His skills are recognised. He's promoted to brigade and then divisional command. And then thirdly, we have a reasonably talented officer of 1914 who probably isn't going to go on to make great works as a general officer, but he is perfectly able to command the battalion reasonably aggressively and competent until the end of the war. What about Bliss, though? And he's on the left-hand side of what appears to be some sort of regimental tea towel. He's aged 48 at the outbreak of war. He's slightly unusual because he's the son of a barrister who's an immigrant from Nova Scotia. He's educated at Haileybury, at which many of the battalion commanders that I've come across were educated at Haileybury. And he becomes CO in October 1913. He's got no war experience whatsoever. He's never fought in combat. But he served as a regular adjutant for 4 years. One of his officers, as John Baines sets out, describes him as Crimean in many ways, steeped in outmoded tradition and not prone to delegation of duties. And reviewing his officers' opinions of him, John Baines summarised, he was not very clever, but he was genuine and sincere, and within his limitations, a sound, practical officer. So, what's the truth about the battalion commanders of August 1914? Are they the sons of professionals like Bliss? Are they the sons of the upper classes? What is their experience? What sort of war service, what sort of staff service do they have that pick them out as competent officers? Were they outmoded and uninspiring like Bliss, or were they men who were capable of moving up the chain of command? Here's one view of the BEF in August 1914, which you'll be very familiar with, and that's Edmonds. In every respect, the Expeditionary Force of 19 was incomparably the best trained, best organised, and best equipped British Army which ever went forth to war. Note that Edmonds doesn't actually say the best led. And Tim Travers would agree would agree with anybody who put up the proposition that it might have been quite poorly led. And reflecting on battalion command, Travers has one thing to say, and that's about 10th Brigade in August 1914. Brigadier General Aylmer Haldane recalled that 3 out of 4 battalion commanding officers were not fit for command, and all had been sent home by the end of September. Haldane may have been overcritical, but the ratio of incompetent officers in the 10th Infantry Brigade was probably not unique. So what is Travers saying? Is he saying that 3/4 of the COs of August 1914 were incompetent soldiers? If you look at the bottom, you'll see the 3 people who he's referring to, one whom you probably won't have heard of, which is D.W. Churchill of the 1st Irish Fusiliers. Mannering and Elkington you will have heard of, because they, of course, surrendered Saint-Quentin, although the surrender was withdrawn. So what Travers is doing is picking on one of the most unusual events of battalion command during the First World War to condemn all the battalion commanders of August 1914 out of hand. Travers' criticisms of the officer corps are, by and large, the following. That firstly, that they're Victorian and public school in their attitude. How guys who are born in the Victorian era and have been to public school can avoid being otherwise, God only knows. He describes an army dominated by personalities and friendships. He describes an overwhelming emphasis on social and regimental hierarchy. He condemns or ignores the tactical reforms of the British Army, saying that they're leading to merely a discussion of tactics. But he says this doesn't mean that at the lower levels the army was not well trained and well led in August 1914. Well, he's certainly not including battalion commanders in that remark. Travers, however, wouldn't have been the only person to criticise the army. Viscount Esher, who of course was on the Elgin Committee looking at the problems of the Boer War, said the following: only 2 out of every 40 regimental officers were any good at all. The rest were loafers. Well, we'll see whether these chaps loafed or not. Establishment of August 1914. If you look through the army list, you've got 1,171 regular lieutenant colonels. You've got 167 infantry lieutenant colonels and 157 regular battalion commanders. And as you see there, 123 of these guys are going to see service on the Western Front before the end of the year. Interestingly, the Army had 47 lieutenant colonels in the pay corps. So you see that they got their priorities right. Nobody ever talks very much about the Special Reserve, but there were actually 101 Special and Extra Reserve commanding officers, and there were 207 Territorial COs, and 23 of these guys, whom I'm going to come on to discuss briefly at the end, would see active service before the end of the year. So, where do these people come from? And on the column on your left, you've got all commissions, and on the column on the right, you've got the origins of the commanding officers of August 1914. So what you can see is that less of the commanding officers are coming from the ranks, less of them are coming from the militia or the Special Reserve, and more of them are coming through RMC and university. So what you have built into the system is the selection of educated men in terms of what education passed for at the point that they were training. And that wasn't their responsibility, that the educational system in the 1870s and 1880s was not as good as it was post-war. How will these men actually become battalion commanders? Were they waved in under the banner of patronage? No, they weren't. You could become a CO or you could take the exams, because that's what it was. These men were examined. It was an exam of fitness to command. And to take fitness for command, you had to be senior. You had to have the recommendation of your existing battalion commander. And of course, you had to pass the exam. Two parts. There's a written paper, 3-hour theoretical paper, which consists of a tactical problem involving the operations of a force not exceeding a brigade of infantry, with a brigade of artillery and a regiment of cavalry, and a proportion of mounted infantry, Royal Engineers, Army Service Corps, and Royal Army Medical Corps. So actually what lieutenant colonels are required in their exam to coordinate is actually a combined arms operation. The candidate has to write a general appreciation of the situation, the action which he proposes to take, and the orders necessary for the execution of his plan. So he has to be operationally on the ball. Second part of the exam takes place in the field with troops. He's examined by a board of 3 officers, the president of which is a general. His task is to command in any minor tactical operations which may be ordered a mixed force of which the strength must not be less than 1 battalion of infantry, a battery of artillery, and 1 squadron of cavalry, to which may be added a proportion of mounted infantry and Royal Engineers. And he's doing this against a real enemy, so there are enemy troops in the field. So the candidate is given the general idea the night before, and then he's expected to respond to a special idea on the ground, to which he has half an hour to respond and hand in his written orders. Credit was given for intelligence, judgment, common sense, and readiness of resource in making the best of any situations. So again, on the ground, lieutenant colonels are being required to conduct a combined arms operation. This would indeed weed out the inadequate. And as you'll see at the bottom of this slide, in 1912, there's 38% failure rate. So there isn't a shoo-in to battalion command. There is quality control. The previous slide, which I glossed over really, is a quote from Edwards, which is, "Military talent is rare and not immediately evident. Seniority rules bar its ascent." And that's, of course, quite true, because the army is dominated by seniority, but we often forget that seniority was a vast improvement over the purchase of commissions. It introduced higher quality control into the army. But, again, second point from the bottom, in the period August 1911 to August 1915, 15% of commanding officer appointments involved passing over officers senior to them. So the army wasn't hidebound by the seniority principle, nor was it hidebound by regimental particularism, which is one of Travers's criticisms, because 16% of these men achieved command in a regiment that was not their regiment of origin. Where'd they come from? Well, they clearly, as you can see from this slide, they had an upper or upper middle class background. There's a good third from the peerage and the landed gentry. There's a quarter from a previous military background. And where they come from, professional families, these are the higher professions of the church and the law. Not all of the titled were fools. This guy with a wonderful name, Reginald Lenormand Brabazon, the Lord R.D., who was commanding officer of 1st Grenadier Guards in August 1914, is transferred to the 1st Irish Guards, goes on active service, and he's wounded. He's wounded quite severely, so he has to serve as a colonel in the Ministry of Munitions for a long period. But he then goes back to command 4 Guards Brigade, where again he has the misfortune to be wounded. But this was a man clearly with ability. He wasn't a fool because he was a toff. Military families, as you saw, made up a quarter of the origins of the commanding officers of August 1914. And I love this picture of these oldies. Now, these are the sons of General Sir L. Nicholson, Royal Engineers. Now, standing from the right on the back, we've got Captain Bertram Nicholson. Next to him, we've got General Octavius Nicholson. Next to him, moving towards the left, we've got Major General Sir Francis Nicholson. And then the odd one out, the shorter bloke at the end of the back row, is George Nicholson, a civil engineer. Seated from the right, and another odd one out, we've got Charles Nicholson, who is a lawyer. Then in the middle, we've got Major General Sir Cecil Nicholson, who at the outbreak of war was the commanding officer of 2nd East Lancs. And just to prove that they weren't stuck with the army, the bloke seated on the left at the bottom is Vice Admiral Sir Douglas Nicholson. So what an extraordinary family to have 4 generals and an admiral with him. Of course, they all weren't quite as extensively promoted as this, and if you want to look at another guy, take Wiegand de Falb, who was commanding 1st North Staffordshire at the outbreak of war and becomes a brigadier general in early 1915. He's the son of a Danish Navy captain. In terms of the other professions, Lieutenant Colonel C.E.A. Jourdain, who's the commanding officer of the 2nd Loyal North Lancs. He's the son of the rector of Mappleton, the father of Lieutenant Colonel L.I. Wood, who was commanding officer of 2nd Border. He's also, he's a solicitor actually, and as was Bliss's father. And Lieutenant Colonel A.W. Abercrombie, 2nd Connaught Rangers, he's the son of a Bengal civil servant. So what isn't happening in the COs of August 1914, you are not seeing the lower professions of engineers. Sorry, Trevor? Psychologists, yes, of which I am one. You are not seeing these sorts of lower professions providing senior officers within the army, and this, of course, is one of the major changes that comes about within the war. The guy who we saw in the middle of that splendid set of pictures is Cecil Lothian, Johnny Nick Nicholson. And just because he's come from a military family and he's got a military background, he isn't a shoo-in. He's commanding officer of 2nd East Lancs from February 1912 to June 1915. He's passed his staff college exams. He's served as ADC to the Governor of Gibraltar. He's been a staff captain, a deputy assistant quartermaster general, a brigade major. He's been a GSO2. And he goes on to be temporary brigadier general from June 1915 to July 1916 with 16 Brigade. And then, of course, he becomes a successful major general from mid-1916 until the end of the war with 34 Division. This is a man who is no shoo-in because of his military background. This is a man who shows long-standing, growing ability throughout the war. How old were they? Well, they weren't young men. The average age is just under 48. And if you want to compare that with the age of commanding officers at the end of the war, they're 34 years, 11 months old during the 100 days. So what's that? 13, 14 years difference. But they'd been in post a long time. Commission to lieutenant colonel is 28 years, 10 months. So these men have a lot of military experience and a lot of time in the army under their belts. If you're looking at promotions to lieutenant colonels during the course of the war, you're seeing many men being promoted from the key civilians of August 1914 to become battalion commanders. You're looking at them being promoted in a 20-month period, which just shows what the exigencies of war do. So they have a raft of military experience behind them. 22% of them are past staff college. So these are intelligent men with the ability for staff service, and we'll have a look at this in a bit more in now. 82% of this group of commanding officers had peacetime staff experience. 49% had wartime staff experience, and 60% has served as an adjutant to either a regular or special reserve or TF battalion in peace or war. Now people say, well, it served as an adjutant. But actually, if you were a commanding officer, you wouldn't want a fool as an adjutant. You'd want as much work taken as competently off your shoulders as could be. So I would propose that the 60% of the men who served of these commanding officers had served as adjutant were very organisationally able. To give you some examples, Sidney Charles Fishburne Jackson, commanding officer of the 1st Hampshires, he only gets 3 days look-in the war, unfortunately. He's shot in the leg and ankle at Nowroy, and he's taken a prisoner of war. He's actually carried to the priest's house at Bellicourt, where the Hindenburg line is broken and the Saint-Quentin Canal is crossed 4 years later, and he's taken prisoner of war there. Well, he hasn't got a PSC, so he's not been to staff college, but he's recognised as being a highly able man, because just look at this list of staff positions. ADC to a Major General, ADC to the Commander-in-Chief East Indies. He's been a station staff officer, Deputy Assistant Adjutant General in India, and he's been a Deputy Assistant Adjutant and Quartermaster General to 8th and 6th Divisions of Irish Command. So he hasn't just got his staff service in India, he's seen it in the UK as well. This man is undoubtedly a loss to the army during the war. This man I love. He's Sir Adrian Grant Duff. He's the commanding officer of the 1st Black Watch at the opening of the war. Look at him. I think he looks so much like Richard Holmes. He's come from the upper crust of society. He's the son of Sir Mountstuart Grant Duff, who's a Liberal MP and a Privy Councillor. He's a PSC. And he's done exactly what Elgin would have wanted British officers to do. He's been part of the general staff that was created after the Boer War. And he's been Assistant Military Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defence. And he's done that for 3 years. And what this man does is he produces the war book, which is the instructions for mobilisation. And what he particularly does is to invent a particular column format so that each department can see what it's doing in relation to another department at any point in time. This is a bright man. And as you can see from the stone on the right-hand side of the slide, he dies early in the war. He's killed on the Aisne on the 14th of September 1914. He's shot twice, carrying ammunition bandoliers to his men in the front line. War service. We've reviewed their staff service, and we've seen them to be a organisationally able group. What was their war service? Well, 88% of them had war service. This works out as a rather uncomfortable figure of 1.7 campaigns. Think of it as 2. How was it split? 16.5% against African tribes, 37% in Asia, so in either on the northwest frontier or in Burma, but nearly half of them had seen service during the Second Boer War. In fact, 13% of them have already had command in the field because they've commanded at a rank lower than lieutenant colonel in various conflicts. So you've got WCG Henniker, 2nd North Staffs. He's actually been in command of the army in southern Nigeria in 1902 and 1903. Small army, one suspects. 8 had commanded mounted infantry columns in South Africa. Colonel J. Ponsonby, 1st Coldstream Guards, had commanded the 5th New Zealand Regiment in South Africa. W.M. Watson of the 1st Duke of Wellington's had commanded a Chinese regiment during the Boxer Rebellion. Lieutenant Colonel G.C. Knight, 1st Loyal North Lancs, had both raised and commanded the 1st New South Wales Mounted Infantry Regiment. So we've got men who have, a small percentage of which have actually got experience of command in war. Let's just take 2 examples of their war service. Frederick Gor Anne Lee, commanding officer of the 2nd Essex. He's the son of a Royal Artillery colonel. He's actually served in 6 campaigns, the first 5 of which are in the Sudan. And when you look at what actually these campaigns are about, of course, they're astonishingly modern because they're all against Islamist fundamentalist insurgency. And he's been in South Africa for the duration of the Boer War, commanding a mounted infantry battalion. Ernest Peter Strickland, commanding officer of the 1st Manchesters, whose father was somewhat more lowly as a major. He'd served in Burma, in Dongola, and Dongola is one of the Sudanese campaigns, and he like Anne Lee, has served 3 times on the Nile. So we've got men here who have a great richness not only of organisational ability, but a richness of war experience. So, if we're going to make some points about them, what would be those points? Well, their basic military education being conducted in the 1870s and the 1880s would undoubtedly be inferior to that of the lieutenants and captains who might well have aspired to succeed them in command of their battalions. But the bias was towards educated men. As we've seen, 22% of them had passed staff college, 85% had staff experience, 60% as adjutant, but 52% of this staff experience had been outside the regiment. So we can't accuse these men of being regimentally blinkered. 88% of them had war service, as we've seen, especially in South Africa. What's important is that their Boer War experience was as captains, by and large. Now, we all know that the Boer War leads to a revolution on the ground in terms of tactics, which is codified in 1902 in the combined training document. But all of the regular army would have been working, as Spencer Jones has clearly pointed out, to a new set of tactics that would prove to be perfectly fit for continental warfare during the Boer War. So what we have is a group of men who have done their learning of new tactics at a point when they weren't set too hard in their ways in terms of their army careers. We could question the value of their small war experience. Of course we could. There was no comparison between the small war punitive expeditions and continental warfare. But the experience of the army in South Africa, specifically in the opening months of the Boer War, was as near to continental warfare as anybody is likely to get. And of course, when condemning the breadth of experience of the British officer, one mustn't forget that the German army, which had only fought actually 2 small campaigns in Africa since 1870, would have undoubtedly given its eye teeth to have had this experience of warfare. So, they had experience well suited to the encounter battles of 1914. As masters of logistics, they were particularly well suited to conducting the retreat of 1914. The fact that none of their war experience suited them for the attritional positional warfare that established itself after December 1914 is not unique to the British Army. It was unique to all the armies engaged. What happened to them? During 1914, by the 31st, 18 of them were dead. And to give you one example of one of these chaps, let's first go through where they were killed. None at Mons, 2 at Lakato, 1 at Villas Cotterets, 1 on the Marne. But it's the Aisne and 1st Ypres that is particularly expensive to commanding officers. But if we're going to take an example of one of them, let's take this guy, Lieutenant Kernan Henry Howell Cadogan. Now, he's commanding 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers on the outbreak of war. He's schooled at the Royal Academy at Gosport, where he fails the exams for both Woolwich and Sandhurst. He joins the Special Reserve. He goes into the 4th Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and he comes under the patronage of Colonel the Honourable Savage Mostyn, who's the late commander of the 1st Battalion. As many of the Special Reserve officers do, he goes and attends a crammer, and then after 11 months, he passes the Militia Comprehensive Exam, and he gets a commission in his patron's late battalion, the 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He serves in Hazara in 1891 and in China in 1900. He's been an adjutant. He's assistant commandant of the Mounted Infantry School in India. Interestingly, this bloke who was appointed as CO in 1912 actually passes his tactical fitness for command in September-October 1909. And he writes from India to his mum when he's been given command of the battalion, "Lloyd, who is senior to me, has been passed over, and I have got command of this battalion." So again, seniority is not the driving issue in appointment to command. "I must say I shall be a very proud man indeed, for I shall be one of the youngest colonels in the service, being only 2 days over 44. I shall be entitled to my pension 2 days after reaching my 48th birthday. £420 a year is a very different pension from £200, which is all I should have got if I'd been passed over." Hal Cadogan lands in France on the 7th of October 1914. From the 19th to the 31st, the battalion is in constant combat. They wind up at Zandvoort, surrounded. Colonel, adjutant, 3 officers, and 250 men. Every officer is either killed or wounded, and 90 men escape. Hal Cadogan's last known order was "stay in your trenches," and he died next to his adjutant, shot through the head just over the left eye. Clearly a talented man, again lost by the savagery of the fighting of August 1914. 5 of them, as you saw, were taken prisoner of war. And just to say briefly about this chap, and I'm sorry about the quality of the picture, you'll recognise the woman on the right-hand side of the slide. Dudley Karan Boja is the commandant of the 1st Cheshires on the outbreak of war. They're surrounded during the retreat from Mons. Boja is wounded in the foot, and he's captured with his company sergeant major Frank Meechin. After various adventures which involve wearing floppy hats and peasant coats, they wind up under the care of Edith Cavell, who you see on the right, and Boger is in fact the first of the British officers that Cavell actually helps. His foot is operated on, and he and Meechin attempt to escape to the Dutch border. Meechin makes it. Boger is limping, and rather like me, stops for a drink prior to crossing the border, unwisely, because that's where he's captured, and he remains in captivity for the rest of the war. I've been talking as if there were no problems with this group of men. I've been singing a little eulogy about them. But of course, some of these officers did not prove competent. First of them, and interestingly, is this guy, Noel Amar Lowry Currie, who was commanding officer of the 2nd Grenadier Guards. Now, he's sent home in August 1914, but they're under rather unusual circumstances because he and Colonel Morris of the Irish Guards decide to retire without telling their brigade commander that they're retiring at Mons. And Currie takes upon himself to make this decision, believing, as field service regulations would have suggested to him, that the man on the spot is the key decision maker. But the army decides that no, in this case it isn't, because Currie is hauled over the coals and sent home. Interestingly enough, the War Office mark him in a letter concerning these guys who are sent home as not an inefficiency case. Actually, Currie was an inefficiency case because he's given command of 3rd Coldstream Guards, sent out to France in the middle of 1915, and lasts no more than a couple of months. We've got Churchill, whom you saw earlier as being castigated by Brigadier Aylmer Haldane. Churchill wasn't a fool. He had passed staff college, he'd been a transport officer in Chitral, he'd been a deputy assistant adjutant general in Ceylon, he's been a brigade major at GSO2, he's seen service on the Nile, he's seen service throughout the Boer War. But this is what Haldane has to say about him. He has evidently allowed slackness in his battalion in spite of my warning when I first took over command of the brigade, and subsequently, there is too much eyewash about this battalion. They do not take interest in anything but sport, and the CO is a humbug. As long as he's in command, much improvement is impossible, but it's not easy to get rid of a CO in peacetime. Well, after his performance at Lakato, Churchill is indeed sent home on the 10th of September. But again, to prove the fact that the man isn't a fool, he serves as a GSO2 from December 1914 and a GSO1 from 1st of July 1916 until the end of the war. So I think that what we have here is a man who probably wasn't suited to combat in the first place. This man's interesting, Cecil Wanless. If you look on the internet, you'll find out that he's an Australian. He's reputedly the first commanding officer to lead a bayonet charge, and he was reputedly severely wounded. At the outbreak of war, he was the commanding officer of 2nd South Lancs. However, Hubert Hamilton, commanding 3rd Division, judged him as totally unfit to command in the field. This decision was approved by Smith Dorrien, Field Marshal French, and even his brigadier McCracken. He's put on the sick list, he's ordered complete rest, and he's sent home. And for the remainder of war, he's in charge of training battalions, and he's desperately trying to get back into active service. However, if you look in the diaries of Brigadier General Alexander Johnston, you'll see that the problems in 2nd South Lancashire persisted long after Wanless had left. So either Wanless caused the problems in the battalion, or the battalion caused a lot of problems for Wanless. I am not sure. However, he was not up to dealing with them. I'm not going to reiterate the story of Elkington and Mannering. You will know it well. But Haldane said of them, they'd done both good service in peacetime. Haldane thought actually that Mannering shouldn't have been past fit for overseas service, because when he'd been on manoeuvres in Gravesend in September 1913, he suffered very badly from ulcerative colitis, and he'd actually had to leave the battalion during its manoeuvres. So probably this was a sick man who should never have gone on service in the first place. When they leave Saint-Quentin, Elkington leaves alone. He actually leaves his battalion. He goes to an unknown destination. And Mannering is described as very pale, entirely dazed, exhausted, could scarcely have known what he was doing. So these were both men who'd had 3 or 4 days of very violent active service. Both are cashiered. Mannering probably appropriately subsides into obscurity. Elkington, of course, joins the French Foreign Legion, fights on Vimy Ridge, and his career in the French Foreign Legion is only ended by his femur being smashed. His rank was reinstated, but interestingly, he was not pardoned. However, what we've got here is a list of 6 or 7 of the 167 COs who proved not up to active service and being sent home. You might think that was a reasonably good hit rate. There's Elkington. COs, so the implication there that Mannering was ill and exhausted. COs were not immune from stress. This man is Henry Delma Radcliffe. It's a rather louche picture of him, I'm afraid, taken in India, I think. He comes from a military family. His elder brother Charles actually made Brigadier General. He's commanding the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers at the outbreak of war. He's fought in Burma. He's not a fool. He's a qualified instructor in military engineering. He's a first-class interpreter in German and a second-class interpreter in French. He's bright. He served in South Africa, in Ladysmith and Colenso. He commanded the rearguard company and showed great coolness under heavy crossfire. He's brave. He serves at Mons. He's at Le Cateau, at the retreat. He fights on the Aisne, and then again at Fromelles. But on the night of 26th of October 1914, the medical officer of 19th Field Ambulance records this: "The CO of the RWF spent the night with us, not wounded, but a bit of a nervous wreck. I think he'll be sent down the line." Should we condemn Delm Radcliffe for being exhausted by combat? I think not. I think his breakdown is a reflection of just how savage and demanding the fighting of August to December 1914 was. We've got 6 of the group were promoted to brigade command. But I'll tell you exactly during August 1914, but I will tell you exactly in a short while how many of them were actually promoted during the war. Let's just take the example of 2 who were promoted. Frederick Gor Anne Lee, who is the commanding officer of the 2nd Essex. He goes on to be temporary brigadier general from October 1914 until June 1916, and then he's a major general in 1917. Ernest Peter Strickland, commanding officer of the 1st Manchester, he becomes a temporary brigadier general in January 1915, and then, of course, he becomes the highly successful Major General of 1st Division from June 1916 until the end of the war. And we'll go on. There's Strickland, a rather noble-looking man to my mind. At the end of December 1914, what was the position in command in the British Expeditionary Force in France? 42% of the original lieutenant colonels were still in post, but 44% of battalions were commanded by majors of August 1914, 13% commanded by captains, 1% by a 2nd lieutenant. So if you look at that, 42% of lieutenant colonels, 44% commanded by senior majors. You might not think that the attrition in command had been that damaging to the army, but the position, in fact, at times had been absolutely desperate. Let's look at the 1st Coldstream Guards. Lieutenant Colonel J. Ponsonby was wounded in the middle of September. He's taken over by the second in command, who is killed at the end of October. There are so few officers left that Lieutenant J. Boyd takes over for 2 days. A captain succeeds him, but he's taken prisoner of war. Lieutenant Boyd has to resume command again. He's succeeded after 2 days by a captain until at the end of November, the original battalion commander returns. The position for Boger's 1st Cheshire was even worse. When he's taken prisoner of war, he's succeeded by a captain, who is then succeeded by a major who's been on the reserve of officers. But this man is a succession of 7 commanding officers during the month of October. So he's replaced by a major who is not part of his regiment. He's succeeded by 3 captains of his regiment and 1 of the Munster Fusiliers. But by the end of October, there's a lieutenant in charge, similar to the battalion that we've just looked at. The lieutenant served for 5 days until he's replaced by another major from the reserve of officers who gives way to a man who's been a regular captain and who is in command at the end of the year. So what is happening for the British Expeditionary Force is that not only is there a certain amount of erosion of senior command, there is an awful amount of erosion of middle-level command. Flavour of this period is given by Herbert Conway Reese. Now, he's a captain of the 2nd Welsh in August 1914. And his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel C.B. Morland, is killed at the end of October at Geluvelt. The battalion is so decimated that Reese is left in command with 1 other officer and 25 men. So he's left over the next couple of months to attempt to rebuild the battalion. But on the 18th or 19th of January 1915, he has to give way to Captain W.M. Hoare. Now, Reese was the 6th senior out of 7 captains in the 2nd Battalion. Hoare, who's been at home serving with the 3rd Battalion, was the 5th senior. So he's pipped by one senior officer, the one above him. Reese noted, Captain Hoare arrived from England and being just senior to me, I had to relinquish command of the battalion. I remained as 2nd in command and discussed on most questions connected with the battalion, as it was very difficult for him just out from home at once to grasp the tactics of the war. But of course he's miffed. He encounters Johnny Gough. I asked him to let me go home to England for a job. I pointed out that I'd commanded the battalion through 3 strenuous months, and that having built them up from the remnants remaining after the first Battle of Ypres, I found my position somewhat difficult. And of course, he goes to 38th Division as a staff officer, and the 1st of July finds him commanding 94th Brigade opposite Serres. So let's try and put some figures around these men's competence. It's difficult because you can't peer into their confidential reports because by and large they don't exist anymore. But if you take out of the equation all of the commanding officers who are either dead, severely wounded and couldn't return to command, prisoners of war, you take out the guys who remained in India, you've got 90 commanding officers whose career you can follow during the war. And you can see what happened to them. 15 were invalided, 16 were sacked eventually, 1 went to the staff, 2 were court-martialed. But look at the list of men who were promoted. 28 to brigade command, 25 to divisional command, and 3 as corps commanders. So what you've got is a viability rate here, meaning that they were endurable and promotable in command of 64%. Tim Travers says that 75% was incompetent. I'm suggesting to you that basically is exactly the reverse, that nearly 3/4 of them were highly competent. Let's just look very briefly at the territorial commanding officers. 16% of these guys were ex-regulars. The rest of them were pure territorial officers. But in terms of their endurance and viability, we need to take a different level of approach to them. To quote Garth Pratton, who is the historian of the Australian battalion commander during the Second World War, he says, senior command was perhaps beyond all but the most committed part-time officer. And Bill Mitchinson, of course, historian of the Territorial Force, although usually keen and proud of their unit, many were, in the opinion of the professionals, not up to the task of command. If we want to look at these men, well, actually, of course, a number of the first-line territorial battalions never saw active service. 26 remained in the UK or were posted to non-combat zones. So we've got 180 commanding officers for the territorial force of August 1914 that we can look at. Well, actually, 71 of these men were removed from command before they even went on active service. Often if you look at battalion or regimental histories, they refer to age and health issues. And I think this is largely euphemistic, that these men actually were not up to the job. Because actually, if you look at their ages, the men who went on active service were actually only 2 years younger than the guys who were removed from command of their battalions and kicked on to either second or the third line territorial battalion. And you might just take some examples of Lord Derby describing Lieutenant Colonel H.L. Beckwith of the 4th Loyal North Lancs as absolutely useless. To show you what sort of man he is, he says he cannot go out to the front now, but we were ready to go out later when the weather gets warmer. I would probably have sympathised with him, I have to say. Similarly, Lieutenant Colonel R.G. Hayes of the 15th London refused to take the Imperial Service obligation. And what happened? So did the men of his battalion not want to go on active service. So it's clearly anecdotally we can see that many of these men simply were not up to scratch. If we go back to this slide, once we take out all the men who didn't go overseas with their battalion, were killed or were injured or whatever, we can follow 85% of the territorial COs of August 1914. And of these, 71% were promoted or served over 6 months in the field. And we can presume that, therefore, we could describe them quite safely as enduring or promotable commanders. However, once you take away the guys who did not take their battalions abroad, were removed from command, what you have is an overall viability rate of 31%, or less than half the regular commanders. One can only conclude that for the territorial force, rather than 2/3 being competent, as we saw for the regulars, that the majority of the territorial commanders really were not up to the challenge of a continental war. So, to come to the end of this, what can we say about the regular COs of the Army of 1914? Were they loafers? Well, I'm damn sure they loafed on occasions. Who wouldn't? But once on the field of battle, these men demonstrated themselves, in the majority part, as being highly competent soldiers. Were they educated? Well, as I've said, they had a certain amount of military education that was technically out of date, and that the military education that newly commissioned officers in the early part of 1914 was receiving was of much higher quality, but that is not these men's fault. What they had actually learnt from was on the job. They had experience. They had considerable organisational experience. they had considerable experience of war. Had they learned nothing from the Boer War, as Tim Travers asserts? No, on the contrary, the whole army had learned tactically from the Boer War and was being trained accordingly, as Spencer Jones has pointed out. Were they regimentally blinkered? No, they weren't. Over half of them had seen staff service outside of their regiments. Were they administratively able? Yes, they were. Were they bogged down by seniority? Well, yes, to a certain extent they were. To a certain extent the whole army was bogged down by seniority, but not as comprehensively as we have been given to assume. We can confidently assert that these men were the most able group of regular COs the British Army had ever fielded, and if we take them as exemplars of the pre-war officer, then the pre-war officer is far more able than Tim Travers and Martin Samuels have given him credit for. Last slide, I promise you. Let's just consider what happened to the battalion command during the war. During the war, the regulars of August 1914 provided 45% of all the active infantry battalion commands of the army. And if you include retired regulars, you've got a 60% of professional soldiers commanding battalions through the war. What developed in the army was a sort of weighted merit-based promotion. There was indeed a continuing discrimination against the territorial officer, and we've seen that probably that was justified in August 1914, in that the competence of senior territorial officers was clearly in many cases quite limited. What also happened during the war was the citizens of August 1914 stepped up to command. They proved able and competent militarians and provided 22% of battalion commands. When these men were replaced during the war, the total number of replacements was 38%. So nearly 40% of the changes of command during the war was replacement. Point being that the British Army took a very, very active approach to quality control in terms of infantry battalion command during the war. If you look at the battalion commanders of the 100 Days, you are looking at a stock of men who are hardy, aggressive, and absolutely, for the most part, there was a 17% replacement rate during 1918, for the most part, highly competent officers. Many of these men were the regular officers, the lieutenants and the captains of August 1914. And again, I would say we can confidently assert that these sorts of figures suggests that that man was of much higher quality than he's been given credit for. Thank you.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly.